everybody to what turns out to be the first meeting of the club this year. As many of you will know, severe weather conditions made it necessary to cancel the 109th dinner, which was planned for the 1st of March, the first time in living memory this has happened. We held off making the decision until the actual morning of the event, but with Princess Street frozen over, new club staff unable to make it in, and speakers cut off in Kelso and Aberdeen, there seemed to be no other option. Anyway, the good news is that it's been possible to reschedule the dinner for 3rd of May, and we hope as many as possible of those who originally were down to attend will be able to make this. In fact, I've just talked to Lee and the numbers are almost the same. It's going to be in this room, by the way, and there are about 3 or 4 places left if anybody would like to come on who hasn't already booked. I'm especially delighted to introduce today's speaker, James Hepburne Scott, who is presently President of the Royal Scottish Forestry Society, a position which coincides fittingly with the club's honouring of Scott's own lifelong interest in afforestation as part of this year's events. He's proud to call himself a kinsman of Sir Walter Scott, his ancestor and Sir Walter being 3rd cousins. More recently, his parents were on good terms with Patricia and Dame Jean Maxwell Scott. Through the Royal Scottish Forestry Society, he himself was an early advisor to the Abbotsford Trust on the management of the woods on the estate. His wife Christian, who is also with us here this evening, also worked for 2 years in a voluntary capacity on the redesigning and furnishing of the Hope Scott wing at Abbotsford. His talk today will focus on Scott's relationship with the Scots of Harden, of Mertoun House. Much has been made by biographers of Scott's feeling of clan loyalty to the Scots of Buccleuch, but if anything, he had a closer and more intimate sense of kinship with the family branch of Harden. He took a special delight in his lineal descent from Walter Scott, 3rd Laird of Harden, Old Wat, who was married to the legendary Flower of Yarrow and renowned for his border exploits, as recounted to Scott by his grandmother. Scott's grandfather held the lease of Sandy Knowe, and of course with it Smailholm Tower, from the then laird, referred to by Scott as his chief and relative. And he was on intimate terms throughout his adult life with the current laird, Hugh Hepburne Scott, and his Saxon-born wife, Harriet Brule, daughter of a famous chess player, and herself a supplier of German books to Scott at the onset of his literary career. In researching materials for a forthcoming edition of Scott's shorter verse, we were able to locate 2 original Scott's poems in the Scott of Harden papers now lodged in the Register House. The first swearing loyalty to the Scott of Harden's firstborn son, Charles Walter, who died tragically in 1806, another providing, at Harriet Brule's request, an epitaph for another son, George, who died prematurely in 1830 while rector of a parish in Devonshire. An earlier journal entry by Scott in 1827 gives a sense of how joyous this relationship could be. We arrived at Mertoun yesterday and heard with some surprise that George had gone up in an air balloon and ascended 2.5 miles above this lunar earth. Honest George, I certainly did not suspect him of being so flighty. I'm sure I'm not alone in being eager to hear more of such happenings from someone closely connected with the Hardens of Mertoun. James.
Thank you, Peter, very much for your invitation to come this evening and for that excellent introduction, which is actually a great help to me because you've introduced the Harden connection and Old Wat and Muchamouth Meg and all that very nicely, thank you. And the story about the balloon, which I had overlooked in my reading of the family papers, and I did discover it last night. But thank you for that. One tiny correction to what you said. In the days that we're speaking about, the Scots of Harden were not yet Hepburne Scott. That didn't actually happen until about 1820, I think, when the Humby Hepburnes finally died out and the two estates came together. Anyway, I'm here to talk this evening for about 35 minutes. It may stretch to 40, I hope you'll bear with me. Really about 3 homes and their families. And the first home, of course, is Ashy Steel, which I don't think looked exactly like that in those days, probably rather smaller, but it was the best picture I could make appear on the screen. So Ashy Steel first, 2 blanks, and then Abbotsford, which needs no further introduction. I'm so glad that Maida is still there at the front door today, where you can see her in the picture there. And that's exactly, I think, as Scott knew it before, obviously the Hope Scott wing was added later on. And the third home is Mertoun. Some of you will know Mertoun, some perhaps not. It's on the bank of the Tweed, the north bank, slightly nearer to St Boswell's than Kelso. It was built by my family around 1700, and I'm sorry that the Duke of Sutherland's car is occupying the place today where Scott's carriage would have been, awaiting for him to set off on some trip. That is how the house looked when it was completed. The Duke of Sutherland, who bought it, added 2 ostentatious wings, and his son then, when he inherited, promptly took them down again. So that's pretty much exactly how it looked, I think. Just one more thing. No, I'll come on to the other thing in a moment. So then we talk about the families. Obviously, Sir Walter, or Walter as he was at the beginning, and I will refer to him, if I may, this evening as Scott. He married Charlotte, of whom you know, in 1798, when he was 27 and she was 28. And the second family is my family, Hugh Scott of Harden, who lived from 1758 to 1841, and I will refer to him as Hugh. And he married Harriet Brule, who's been introduced to you by Peter. He married her in 1795 when he was 37 and she was 23. Now, Hugh and Harriet are my 4 times great-grandparents. And I would just like to explain a little bit more about the Harden bit, because he called himself Hugh Scott of Harden. And all of our generations who lived at Mertoun called themselves Scott of Harden, because Harden was and still is the family seat. The Harden that we know is slightly bigger than the tower built by Old Wat in about 1550, late 1500s. The great Border Reaver and his wife, Mary Scott, Flower of Yarrow. I wish we had more time to talk about them. And so he called himself Scott of Harden, but he didn't actually ever live there. He lived at Mertoun. This is Hugh we're talking about, and Harriet. The interesting thing, the first interesting thing about Scott, Sir Walter, and Hugh is that the Mertoun estate was bought by my family in about 1640 by William Scott, son of Old Wat, and it was he who avoided hanging by marrying Agnes Murray of Elibank, otherwise known as Mucklemouth Meg, at the last minute. I dare say you know that story, I could relate later on. But it was William who escaped the gallows and married Meg and went on to buy Mertoun estate. The commencement of the building of the house, I think, was probably commenced by their son. How they acquired the money to do all this, I have no idea, and my learned father never was able to explain to me either. But the interesting connection with Scott is that they bought the Mertoun estate from the Halliburton family. Now, Sir Walter, I'm just going to call Scott, his grandmother was Barbara Halliburton, was she not? So, how it was that his grandparents were still residing at Sandinow as tenants of the Mertoun estate, having, I'm making the connection, it's the same Halliburton, having sold the estate to Scott, who bought it and allowed them to stay on as tenants. That's what I'm imagining. You may be able to correct me on that. So, Scott and Harriet are the 2 principal characters in my talk. And in 1795, we have him writing to a friend. Most of my talk, I should say, is around his letters, and I will be quoting from his letters, and you'll forgive me for reading them. This was a short one. He was staying with his grandparents at Sandinow at that time, and I should have said that Hugh's great-grandparents lived at Sandinow incorrectly in Smaleham Tower while they were building Mertoun. in some considerable discomfort, but it would have resembled Harden in those days, a similar sort of establishment. So here is Scott, my first quote from his letters. He writes to this unknown friend, "We have a great marriage forward here, Hugh Scott of Harden, and the daughter of Count Brule, the famous chess player, a lady of 16 quarters. So let me just introduce Harriet in a little more detail. Her father, as you've heard, was Count Brule. He was the ambassador from Saxony to the court of St. James. He was indeed a world champion chess player. He was an astronomer of some renown. And his wife, Harriet's mother, was the Dowager Countess of Egremont. Lord Egremont having been her first husband and died, then she married Brule. She was a lady in waiting to Queen Charlotte, and so I think that Harriet's early life was largely at court, being with her mother. She was a highly cultured lady, as you can imagine. The Brule estate lives on in East Germany, and the amazing houses, palaces that they occupied, and you can see on the website today. So she had a very, very, well, you might say, elegant parentage, really, between Petworth and the Brule establishments in Saxony. Harriet, was a year younger than Scott, but they became lifelong friends, and that will become evident through the correspondence. He described her as the first real lady of fashion who took me up. In October 1797, he was in Kelso by now, staying with his uncle and aunt, and he rode over to Mertoun to consult Hugh and Harriet about his approaching marriage to Charlotte. His family were being difficult about this, and he needed advice. The courtship was being conducted through Lord Downshire, her ward, or her guardian rather, she was the ward. However, unfortunately, another visitor turned up, and there was no chance of a confidential conversation, and he rode back the next morning. But we find him on the 25th of November writing to Charlotte, his fiancée by then, "I have a letter from Mr. Scott of Harden, congratulating me," etc., etc. He speaks, like all the world, most highly of Lord Downshire, but indeed I need nothing to raise him in my opinion, for he has behaved in the most handsome manner in this business, and he really loves my little Charlotte. I should say that these letters are mostly, or many of them are quite long, and I'm only going to quote quite short pieces, forgive me, and I'll try and indicate where I'm truncating, but I may fail in that on some occasions. In 1803, he needed to reside near to his duties, as the law required, Selkirk and Edinburgh. Hugh offered him Harden, which was empty, but he declined it sensibly. I think it was in very rough state of repair at that time, and it was not particularly near, it was nowhere near Edinburgh, and not very near Selkirk either. So he declined that offer, and we have him on the 25th of May 1808 writing to Harriet. "My dear Mrs. Scott, I was honoured with your letter and will carefully attend to your instructions." More about those in a moment. "Mr. Scott cheated us of a visit the last time he was in town, and as we afterwards learnt, how by just retribution had almost been cheated of his dinner at Moorbattle. I have just been dismissing to press a new edition of Marmion. Mrs. Scott joins in kind compliments to Mr. Scott. We hope to see you at Ashestiel in July, where the days are long and pleasant. Believe me very truly, dear madam, your obliged and respectful humble servant, Walter Scott." Now, the instructions he'd had from Harriet were in respect of some prints which had been created of Mr. Shetke's paintings. Mr. Shetke was a renowned marine painter, I think certainly appreciated by the Brule family. We will hear more about Shetke later on, or at least his sister. In 1810, he's writing to Harriet, who is nursing, I think it must be her half-brother, Lord Egremont, who is clearly unwell. "My dear Mrs. Scott, I am proud of the fact that the Lady of the Lake can divert an hour's pain or lassitude, though very sorry Lord Egremont should need her assistance for that purpose. The line he mentions must be a very indifferent one, for I have had repeated applications for a commentary. The best I can give is that I thought the foxglove a stiff, glaring sort of flower, and no bad emblem. As to the nightshade, you know its deleterious qualities, and it can in my confused head that the ancients used its juice in poisoning state criminals. Bruised hemlock was, however, employed for that purpose in the affair of Socrates. Nor am I prepared to affirm that my own recollection will prove more accurate in any other, though I have never inquired. In transmitting this account of my meaning to Lord Egremont, be so good as to take notice that I give it under the reservation of my privilege to adopt any more ingenious meaning which my critics may find out for me. On returning to Edinburgh au plus vite, I fear I shall have difficulty from the state of official duty to be out upon 5th of June, but we shall meet and be merry in summer. P.S. I have a nice little foal at Ashy Steel for the little cousins. All this bit about herbal remedies and all this bit, I only discovered that quite recently. He's quite imaginative, I think, as he rather admits that he's prepared to accept other suggestions on the subject. Anyway, we then have him writing to Sophia, his daughter. She's aged 14 and her pony, Cuddy, has died. And he writes, I shall give you a most beautiful peacock and peahen. So tame they come to the porch and feed out of the children's hands. Well, the peacock and peahen were actually a present from Mertoun, so it was the Mertoun's children's hands out of which they were feeding. Anyway, they found their way to Ashy Steel. And at this point, I must introduce the children into our story. There were 4 at Ashy Steel, I think by then, and I don't have pictures of them good enough to show you, I'm sorry to say, good enough to reproduce on the screen, but there were 8 at Mertoun, and here they are, drawn by their mother in 1808. And George, who went up in the air balloon, which one is the... Oh, now I've really blown it, haven't I? I've turned it off. I'm not going to risk pointing again. George, who went up in the air balloon, is this chap here, and his older brother, the oldest of the family, is Henry Francis, who succeeded his father, and of whom we will hear more anon. What I like about this picture is Harriet did it in 1808, as I told you, 5 weeks after the birth of her youngest, who is lying on the lap of her eldest sister there, and she looks to me as if she's been added in later on. Maybe she started this before giving birth and she wasn't sure who she was going to have, or indeed if she would have a live baby at all, I guess. And the little dog curled up in the corner there is called Pommy, and my mother has, or she did have, she died recently, but she's bequeathed to my son, younger son, a little tiny oil painting of Pommy in exactly that position, curled up in a basket. So those are the 8 Mertoun children, and there was a Christmas tradition that the Scots of Abbotsford would spend Christmas at Mertoun with their cousins. And in 1810, on the 22nd of December, Scott is writing to Lady Abercorn. We are about to set forward in the middle of a snowstorm, I fear, to keep an old hereditary engagement of eating our turkey and cheese with my friend and chief, Mr. Scott of Harden, on Christmas Day. I think more often it was goose, but anyway, sometimes turkey and sometimes goose. During his stay there, he wrote to Joanna Bailey, if there be anything incoherent in this letter, pray ascribe it to my writing in the neighbourhood of a ball. For all the little Scots of Harden, with a greater part of my own, are dancing the new year in. He writes his bread and butter thank you from Edinburgh on the 5th of January. My dear Mrs. Scott, amidst the confusion of preparation for Twelfth Night, Charlotte deputes me to answer your kind inquiries after our journey, which was very tolerable, snow and sickness considered. Anne was sick the whole way, but caught no cold, and was very well next morning. Snow was a means of delay, but no serious obstacle, excepting at the top of Sutra, where it was drifting for a little way. Our little people return the warmest recollection of the hospitality of Mertoun, and the kindness of their young friends. We too are delighted to find that even a long visit, so trying in many respects, has not been too much for the patience of our valued friends. We cannot find that we have left a music book, and suspect some mistake in that matter. Charlotte joins in kindest and best remembrances to Mr. Scott and to the little folks, whom Anne and Sophia send as many greetings as the paper will hold. Believe me, my dear Mrs. Scott, your ever faithful and respectful, humble servant, Walter Scott. 2 little points here. I'm interested in the preparation for Twelfth Night celebrations, and maybe some of you know more about that. That was clearly a festival in its own right. And of course the Sutra road was not where it is today, but rather to the west, following the old Roman road, and it would have just been a grass track in those days. Pretty rough at the best of times, I guess. On the 2nd of July, he's writing to Harriet again, and this is the first mention of his intention of buying land. It's a preamble letter, but this is where we get to the point where he says, rather endearingly, I think, in the third person singular, and I don't know whether you've met a lot of this before, but he refers to himself in the third person. Reports say that the Sheriff of Selkirkshire has actually bought that pleasant farm, lately belonging to the worthy Dr. Douglas of Garside, and that he intends to build a bower there next summer. We hear one of his principal motives for making this large purchase was to draw a little nearer to his kind beloved friends at Mertoun. I have nothing to add to discuss it except the house which Jack built will sink in comparison to the cottage which is to be built, of all of which I hope we will have an early opportunity of talking, since we set out for Ashestiel on the 12th current, or next day at farthest. My best compliments to Mr. Scott and the little folks, etc. Soon after, another undated letter. My dear Mistress Scott, I take the opportunity of greeting you by the messenger, capital M, who comes to reclaim Lady Wallis, your quadruped pensioner, in brackets. Lady Wallis, your quadruped pensioner, whose filly, I suppose, can now more than dispense with her service. I hope James Stewart will handle the filly often and use him to see and receive kindness from men, which makes the training of that breed of ponies the easiest thing in the world. I'm truly glad that you like Don Roderick, but I'm now dreaming of nothing but cottages upon Tweeddale. If I escape being declared crazy for my various projects, I shall be anxious to have the advantage of your taste. I hope you think of coming up Tweed while days are long and skies somewhat clear. Charlotte and I will be delighted to see any of the kind Christmas cousins that you will admit into the party. Kind compliments to Mr. Scott. I am now a complete convert to his opinion about bullion, as the Roxburghshire and Merse lairds are to his railway, etc. Anything more or hints you can offer me about the bullion when I finish speaking, I would be intrigued to know. I thought perhaps this was something to do with his successful pursuit of Scotland having a single currency with England and retaining the pound and all the rest of it, but it's too soon. That all came much later, so I'm intrigued by this bullion business. In January 1812, he's writing to Patrick Murray of Simprim, a regular correspondent. I now enclose you a packet of papers regarding a projected railway in Berwickshire, a matter much out of my way, and not, I should suppose, particularly in yours, as it is neither intended as a military road, nor even particularly adapted for the conveyance of artillery. But my friend and relation, Mr. Scott of Harden, whose hobby horse this railway happens to be, is desirous of making everyone canter along with him. So here we are in 1812 writing about a railway. That was 15 years before Stockton to Darlington. And so I think he's talking or imagining a horse-drawn railway. But why? Our family received wisdom, for what it's worth, is that Hugh Scott had some crazy plan to build a factory making tiles and drain pipes and perhaps chimney pots, clay things, from the clay that he was going to extract from the top end of Mertoun Estate up near Beamiside, and that he would need a railway to transport them all to the main railway at Berwick. That is perhaps what he was on about, but anyway, it never happened. I think Mertoun Commercial Ventures had a habit of not quite happening. Anyway, on the 21st of January 1815, he's writing to Harriet, who's at Ramsgate. Charlotte and I hope to be in town about March, and if I see which I design, I dare say I shall bring Sophia. I have made a vow with Charlotte that if she chooses to go and return by sea, she shall have the difference of expense to save her from the horror of hackney coaches in London. And I'd love to have your view on what he's talking about there. I'd like to understand that sentence better. Written on the outside of that letter, he says, look at the seal of this letter if you have not happened to break it. It was found on Flodden Field. and I'm sure that seal is still in that lovely glass case in the window at Abbotsford. On the 7th of December 1818, he's writing to Joanna Bailey about the baronetcy which she has been offered by the Prince Regent, whom he describes confidentially as our fat friend. He writes, "The Duke of Buccleuch and Scott of Harden, who as heads of my clan and sources of my gentry are good judges of what I ought to do, have both given me the earnest opinion to accept of an honour, derived from the source of honour, and neither begged nor bought, as is the usual fashion." He goes on. There's a little hint of the pompous Scot coming in here. I mean, if you were offered a baronetcy by the king, do you really write to your family and ask their advice as to whether you should accept or not? Anyway, of course, he did. But the other interesting thing here is he describes Buccleuch and Scott of Harden as heads of his clan. And that is interesting, and to this day, Duke Richard Buccleuch and my cousin Andrew Polwarth, who's married to Christian's sister, and they live at Harden, they do regard themselves still as joint heads of the clan, if indeed you call it a clan in Scotland here. On the 20th of January 1819, he's writing to Harriet. "I owe your kindness for a letter so long unanswered, so I send a piece of good news to make amends for my ungracious delay. I have just conversed with the advocate on the subject of the Polwarth title, upon which he has not the slightest doubt intends to consent to going through the House of Lords, so I shall soon have to wish you joy of a step of honour higher than you had, and I'm very happy to think that when I get a petit titre myself, that the due distance and proportion will still continue in appearance that it must always have done in reality between my chief and myself. It is right to accustom oneself to dignities by times. How do you do, my Lady Polwarth? Thank you, Sir Walter." Now, the advocate was, of course, the Lord Advocate for Scotland, and the Polwarth title, just explain that. Lord Polwarth, that was the older title of the Earls of Marchmont, who lived at Marchmont, beside Polwarth. The third and last Earl of Marchmont died without a male heir. His daughter, Lady Diana Hume Campbell, married Hugh Scott's father. And Sir Walter, although clearly he wasn't quite Sir Walter by then, he reckoned, being the man he was, and with his connections and love of heraldry and genealogy and all that, that Hugh Scott should apply for the title, to inherit the title through his mother's line. And indeed that did eventually come to pass, which is why our family, or the heads of our family, have called themselves Lord Polwarth ever since. Although Scott never was able to call her Lady Polwarth because it didn't actually transfer till 1835, alas, so they didn't have that little bit of fun together. And now we're coming to a letter he writes on October the 19th to his son, Walter. And I'm showing you this because I love this sketch for the great picture by Wilkie, that hangs over the fireplace in the in the library at Abbotsford, which is a great picture, but I really rather prefer this sketch. He was, I can't tell by the badges of rank whether because he's not really wearing any, but whether he was by now a colonel, but he became a colonel in the 18th Hussars and served a lot overseas. So he is at this point in time, on October the 19th, 1819, writing to Walter, who is serving in Ireland. And Walter had left his favourite dog, Trout, behind with his cousin Henry at Mertoun. Henry is Henry Francis, the man up on the top right. And he writes to Walter, "Trout has returned here several times, poor fellow, and seems also to look out for you. But Henry Scott is very kind to him, and he is a great favourite." Later on he writes, "Henry Scott was here today taking leave for Cambridge. He looks melancholy, and I was very sorry to part with him, for he is a good young man. I am by no means sure that his father is taking the best course with him. I suspect that a commission would suit him better than long study at the college, and it's most important that his time should be employed by duty of one sort or another." I think this is rather charming, Scott having been very well educated at university himself, but we do know, don't we, that Scott had expressed I think on several occasions that he would much rather have been a soldier had he had the chance and not had the disability that he did. But he made the very best of the opportunities he did have to be a soldier, and we'll come on to that in a moment. 1819-20, there was industrial unrest among the workers of the new manufacturing towns, and a lot of distress upon the land. Living conditions were appalling, wages were very low, and there was unrest and violence in the offing. Scott, like the rest of his class, country folk, had no real understanding of life in the industrial towns. How could they? And he feared the worst, and I think he almost got the better of him. He suspected a Red Revolution, and he set about plans to raise a local militia in the borders. So here he is writing to Walter, again, on the 20th of December, 1819. And this, again, is tacked on to the end of a much longer letter. He says, "There is much disaffection among the lower orders. I little thought to need my sword again. The peasantry are clamorous to have me as a leader, so I shall look out for a steady horse that will stand fire and sword. But the clan is rising. Gala raises the company, and I think Harden another. At least he is half persuaded to let his son Henry have a company of shepherds. They are to be called dismounted yeomanry, to retrain as marksmen. You know how well they are fitted by their habits for alert sharpshooters. If the alarm continues, the Buccleuch tenancy will also be raised, and we shall have a little army of cavalry and infantry, and if necessary, 2 light guns. After all, I'm sure the dogs will not fight, and I'm sorry for it. One day's good kemping will cure them most radically of their radical malady, and if I have anything to say in the matter, they should remember the day for half a century to come." Strong stuff. In 1821, he's writing to Lord Melville, who, as you know, was really the ruler of Scotland. He writes again, a long letter, this is towards the end. "I think Harden will raise a company of Ettrick men, and put his son, a very fine lad, at the head of it. Their finance will be the worst, for they must have some discipline, and be paid when called out for that purpose. That expense cannot lie on the officers, though, as I mentioned before, we will use every degree of economy, respecting the public purse, and will not spare our private pockets. Gala and I will give £100 each, and get some more. I fear Harden and Torwood Lee will scarce be so free of their cash, but they must do something." Well, the alarm died down, and the regiment was never raised. Thank goodness, I think. In November 1822, he's writing again to Walter, who's in Germany. There is an economic depression looming, and he writes, "We are considerably embarrassed in this country, but the embarrassment lies where it should do, that is upon those who best afford it. Tenants cannot pay their rents, and landlords are fain to abate them greatly. The Laird of Harden lowered his whole estate yesterday from £20 to £10 per cent, and even paid back cash received at the last term. But then things are getting cheaper. The poor have plenty, and are better off than ever they were in my time, since a day labourer may, if he choose, indulge in butcher meat, which he used to taste but once a year." Now we're coming back to the Mertoun children. So I'm going to show you another sketch by Harriet. This was made just before the last one in 1807. And these 2 little ones, they're not her youngest, they're 2 of the middle ones. And they are they're Walter and Anne. Walter is the one sitting down with the skirt on, with the dog, and Anne is the one with the sticks. And this was a sketch for a portrait that was eventually painted, which is really, really beautiful of these 2. This is still with the family. And I'm showing you those because this next letter was written. Now, I'm sorry, I must correct myself. When we last talked about the children, that was in 1810, and the picture I showed you was in 1808, so they were very similar age. But by now we're in 1823, and the children are all obviously much more grown up. Maria Edgeworth was staying at Abbotsford, and they all went over to Mertoun, and her account of that visit is summarised by Carola Oman, who writes, "At Mertoun they were asked to dine and stay all night. But though the house was old and large, it was cold, nothing to Abbotsford. Mrs. Scott was very well bred and fashionable looking, with an English voice. The chief was a little fat man with clarety cheeks, and gentlemanlike, but with an expression of helpless, good-natured indolence. There were 2 young Scots of Harden, Francis and George. I showed you them before. Very dark, very handsome, absolute bears. There were 3 young ladies dressed in blue and white, 1 little and black, 1 tall and pale, and they thought the 3rd must be another sister, until she repaired to the pianoforte after dinner and began to yell. Mrs. Scott of Harden said, of course she is a professional. She was a Miss Shetke, a sort of singing mistress. On the way home in the landau next morning, Sir Walter said, Miss Shetke ought to be assassinated, to which everyone cordially agreed. Now, Miss Shetke, according to my source, who I will reveal at the end, is described as of Transylvanian origin. She was well known to Scott and to the Mertoun Scots, and she had taught apparently several generations to play the pianoforte. She was the sister of the painter referred to in that first letter from Harriet. On the 6th of February 1824, he is writing to Hugh at Brighton. And this is a PS. Now, I think Hugh, from the sounds of this letter, was actually staying with the king, with whom he was by now quite well acquainted. He writes, "Till I got your letter, I was uncertain if you were in town or at Brighton. I beg my most respectful duty to His Majesty, and recommend my own regime to his royal consideration, viz. To rise at 7, dine at 5, go to bed at 11, and be, if possible, 4 hours at least in the open every day. I am convinced this is the way to hold life, joined in moderation in eating and drinking, which it is not necessary to carry to rigours." Now, this is quite sort of condescending advice to the king on how to look after his health, isn't it? But they were on pretty good terms, I think, by then. In January 1825, he is writing to Sir James Ferguson about Walter's suit to Jane Jobson, who was Lady Ferguson's niece. Now, old Mrs. Jobson, and you probably know all this, but old Mrs. Jobson was a strict Presbyterian, and we think she objected to Walter, who was a soldier and therefore profligate. He was the son of an Episcopalian poet and a French woman, so it's pretty bad on all counts, really. It all worked out all right in the end. Scott is writing to Ferguson. Mrs. Scott of Harden gave him the enclosed letter of introduction to a lady of distinction near Cork, where he is serving. All who know Mrs. Scott consider her to be a very severe judge of character, and the last person to patronise a roué or even a coxcomb. Being written by a comparative stranger, a lady of shrewd sense and knowledge of the world may perhaps have more weight than the praise of a partial friend like you, or a father like myself. Writing again to Walter in April of that year, 1825, I hope you've delivered your introduction to Mrs. Scott's friend in the neighbourhood of Cork. Good introductions should never be neglected, though numerous ones are rather a bore. A lady's society, especially when entering on life, should be, as they are said, to choose their liquor, little but good. Mrs. Scott being really a woman of fashion, a character not quite so frequent in reality as aspired to, and being besides such an old friend of yours, is likely to introduce you to valuable and creditable society. Then came the tragic events of 1825 and 6, which we don't need to dwell on this evening. Charlotte died at Abbotsford on the 15th of May, 1826, and he wrote in his journal on the 21st of July, and you will know this because you're familiar with the journal, but it's so relevant. He writes, "To Mertoun we went accordingly. So my lodging was a little room, which I have not occupied since I was a bachelor, but often before in my frequent intercourse with this kind and hospitable family, feeling myself returned to that celibacy which renders many accommodations indifferent, and which but lately were indispensable, my imagination drew a melancholy contrast between the young man entering the world on fire for fame and restless in imagining means of coming by it, and the deprived and aged widower, blasé on the point of literary reputation, deprived of the social comforts of a married state, and looking back to regret instead of forward to hope." In August 1826, again in the journal, he writes of an otter hunt. a grand crusade against the otter with all the Harden boys and a pack of otter hounds whose chidings are really the finest cry in the world. Well, we knew about his love of dogs, didn't we? But his love of otter hunting, well, times move on. He writes to Maria Edgeworth about this time in a PS. After all, I cannot get my franks from Henry Scott, who is in the thick of the otter melee. And the point about this is that the GPO Roland Hill hadn't come to prominence. You didn't have a post office. You had to be an MP to be able to frank your own letters and send them to London. So if you were on good terms with an MP, you could catch a lift in the parliamentary bag, which is what Scott was clearly in the habit of doing. On the 12th of November that year, 26, he writes in the journal, went to sit to Sir Thomas Lawrence, or to Sir T.L., he says, this was Thomas Lawrence, to finish the picture for His Majesty, which everyone says is a very fine one. I think so myself, and wonder how Sir Thomas made so much out of an old weather-beaten block. Now, this picture had indeed been commissioned by the King to hang at Windsor. And 2 days after this letter about the sitting, so presumably he sat on the 13th, and then on the 14th he's writing to Harriet. I have a favour to ask. It is merely an outline of the Eildon Hills, to enable Lawrence to throw them into the background of the portrait he has made of me for Windsor. Properly it should represent them as seen from the west, and if you have a sketch from that point I should prefer it. But such a view as Rayburn has put in your own picture will do quite well, and if you will cause Henry to frank it to Sir Thomas Lawrence, with a note mentioning it is for my portrait, he will understand it perfectly. The portrait is a very fair one, and makes me think I have been very ill-used, gentlemen, on former occasions. So, here we have Harriet's portrait by Rayburn. I think he painted her several times. I know of at least 2 others. But this one I absolutely love. And there, of course, are the Eildons, I think from the east, i.e. somewhere near Mertoun, as you would expect. And thanks entirely to Christian, who did some snappy research on the internet and found Lawrence's picture, which does indeed hang at Windsor to this day. Just one Eildon creeps into the corner, I think probably still from the east, not from the west. But it is rather a delight to have those 2 pictures side by side, isn't it? And the table there, I think, darling, is still at Abbotsford, isn't it? I think so,
but the chair.
The chair,
although it's slightly altered.
Yes, yeah. So, if I can go back, there's Harriet and her Eildons, and somehow she managed to, I don't know how she was able to reproduce that. They didn't have a camera or an iPhone or any fancy way of sending a copy of that down to Sir Thomas Lawrence in London so he could incorporate it in Scott's picture. Oh, fascinating thought. So where are we? In his journal in 1828 he's writing, the Hardens remained today, and I had a long walk with the laird up the glen, and so forth. He seemed a little tired. With all due devotion to my chief, I was not sorry to triumph over someone in point of activity at my time of day. Well, Hugh was 13 years older than him, as I told you, and had just passed his 70th birthday, so I think that was quite cheeky in a way of Scott. Now, in 1829, Hugh is considering a proposal for him to stand as the parliamentary candidate for Berwickshire. Walter wrote to Melville, Scott wrote to Melville offering his support for his cousin's candidacy. He writes, with respect to general politics, there is not a man in Scotland more convinced of the necessity of rallying round the Crown and Constitution at this crisis. Of late years, Mr. Scott has been chiefly settled at his family seat, and his popularity has been constantly increasing with the freeholders. He has been at the heart of every public measure in Berwickshire, and popularity apart, I don't know any gentleman in Scotland who has better pretensions of himself to represent this opulent county, or whose knowledge and habits of business are likely to render more useful to his constituents. Hugh did not, in fact, stand for Parliament. The crisis, I think, was the impending Reform Bill, which, as we know, Scott regarded as disastrous. I omitted to tell you, I'll just go back a quick moment, when we were talking about Henry, or I was talking about Henry being an MP and franking letters and all that, Henry was Henry Francis, we call him. That was the young boy at the top right. He was undoubtedly Scott's favourite of the family, and Scott described him as a real honest lad and my favourite of the young people. A fine fellow and what I call a heart of gold. He has sound parts, which he spelled P-E-A-R-T-S. He has sound parts, good sense, and is a true man. Scott encouraged him in his high Tory and anti-reform principles and worked hard to help secure his election for Roxburghshire, which happened twice. The first time he was unopposed, and the second time he won the seat by the magnificent majority of 40 over 14, such was the size of the electorate prior to the Reform Bill. And it was the second election in which, you'll know this story, Scott's carriage was stoned in Jedburgh by the mob, with cries of "Burke, Sir Walter." Where was I before I digressed? On the 6th of March 1832, he's writing from Naples. A long letter, and he's writing to Harriet. A long letter concluding, "I should have said something of my health, but have nothing to say except that I'm pretty well and take exercise regularly, though, as Parson Adams says, it must be of the vehicular kind. I think I shall never drive or walk again, but I must not complain, for my plan to pay my debts, which you know gave me so much trouble some years since, has been, thank God, completely successful. And what I think worth telling, I have repaid very near £120,000 without owing anybody a halfpenny. At least I'm sure this will be the case by midsummer." He continues, "The young people have been very happy, which makes me think about next spring. I will give your couple a neighbourly dance. It will be about this time I take the management of my affairs again. Your somewhat ancient but very sincere friend, Walter Scott." He died at Abbotsford 6 months later on the 21st of September. The funeral, as you know, was at Dryborough, and Hugh was a pallbearer. Now, I've got one little extra piece to add in here, which doesn't come from my family at all, but it actually comes from Christian's family. And this has only come into our hands very recently. Christian was a Miss Surtees, not directly descended from Scott's great friend, Robert Surtees, but descended in exactly the same way as I'm descended from Sir Walter Scott. And Christian had a lovely, not terribly close cousin who died last year, aged 100, I think, 100, and not long before she died, she passed on this letter to Christian, which was written, I think, I can't quite make out who wrote this letter, but Scott's friend Surtees had died by now, and I think perhaps this was his widow. Anyway, she writes on April the 24th, 1862. Their home is Mainsforth in County Durham, in what used to be Tony Blair's constituency. And I'm just going to read you a bit of this. It'll take a couple of minutes, but it's part of a much, much longer letter. She says, "I knew Sir Walter Scott very well. To hear him talk was like hearing history, with all the disagreeable parts weeded out. I often dined with him in Edinburgh. I went with my sister Surtees to his house just after his first paralytic seizure. We went to take him a book, and not knowing of his illness, my sister Surtees asked if he was at home. The servant said he did not know, so my sister told him just to give Sir Walter the book and say it was left by Mrs. Surtees of Mainsforth. But Sir Walter, who was sitting in his study, heard of my sister's voice and said, 'I'm sure that is Mrs. Surtees of Mainsforth,' and sent to desire us to come in. We found him dreadfully altered, and he described to us all that had happened. 'I was sitting with Sophia when I was taken,' he said, 'and she is dead. They're all dead now. And I could not speak, so I ran upstairs into the drawing room, where there were several ladies in the room, and there I soon became insensible and could not be roused. I remember it as if it were today,' he said. 'They all began to heal, and they made such a tirade you can scarcely imagine it. I did not wish to frighten them more, so I did not say what I felt. But I'll tell you what it was, Mrs. Surtees. I shook hands with death. Lady Scott was brought up in France. She was a very frivolous person, very exceedingly. The first time I dined with them, I sat next to her, and she wore a brocaded silk gown, which she told me cost 200 guineas. 'Dear me, Lady Scott,' I said, 'but is not that a very large price?' 'Yes,' she replied, 'but that's what my dressmaker charges me.' People never knew what present to give Sir Walter, so when they wished to make a present, they gave ornaments to Lady Scott, and she would come down to a common dinner with her arm quite covered with bracelets. What more she could have worn if she went to court, I cannot imagine. She never entered into Sir Walter's pursuits at all. So ends that. Rather fascinating. I don't think he meant that unkindly at all. I mean, why would she enter into his very male pursuits? I'm sure she was a wonderful homemaker, housekeeper, mother, and all the rest that ladies were expected to be. Anyway, I've come to my end, but I must just acknowledge one more person. She's the little chap on the right. Yes, he is a chap. That is my great uncle Patrick Hepburne Scott. Some of you might have known Colin and Anne Baxter. Anne was his daughter, my father's first cousin. Now, that picture I think was taken in the garden at Humby, where the family lived and where Pat was born and grew up. His parents lived at Mertoun. The little fellow on the left, who ought to be pleased to be wearing the trousers, but has a bell round his neck, doesn't look at all happy. But anyway, the point about Uncle Pat was that he was a minister of the church and a historian and a researcher and an archivist, and it's entirely thanks to him that I've been able to share with you these letters, much of which he researched in order to give a talk, I think not unlike this, to an audience somewhere. Thanks to Uncle Pat, who was born in 1899, would have spent a lot of time at Mertoun with his grandparents before the house was eventually sold in 1812. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, James. That was absolutely packed with fascinating insights, and what a strong strand in Sir Walter's life it was, this connection, and how it sort of interweaves with things we know about and casts new light on those things. We've got time for some questions. You did ask us if we knew things that you didn't quite recognise.
I'm sure there's lots.
I'm sure one of the symptoms of a very close correspondence is they talk about things as if they know it, sort of, they don't explain it as they would to an outsider. Any ideas what the bullion was, or what sort of railway was intended in Berwickshire? First, no insights.
The only thing that struck me was Simprim was at one time the stopping point for the great wool trains of the 15th, 16th and 15th century on their way to Berwick when it was the port of Scotland. So it may well be that the route through there was what your forebear had in mind.
Yes, fascinating, because Simprim is a farm. Some people know
it's nothing
near
now.
Coldstream. It's just a farm.
But it used to be a very important sort of staging post.
Intriguing. I mean, Patrick Murray of Simprim was actually living in Fife at that time, I think. But yeah, maybe that's it. Anyway, there's scope for a little more research. And the bullion bit, can anybody throw an idea into the ring there? What on earth was that about? No idea.
Any more general questions or observations?
Corrections. I'm seeking corrections.
I think a correction. I think the painting of Walter Jr. in his uniform. That's Sir William Allen, I think.
Yes.
Was the painter of that. Yes.
In fact, you passed on one. Or how does it go on? The poor man in the black chair. Who is the compere of the brain? Not the brain of Britain. I'm waffling. You passed on one, or whatever it was.
Oh, Magnus
he
Magnusson.
gently corrects you with your things wrong.
Magnus Magnusson was a president of this society and
Was
gave
he?
a wonderful address. Yes. Any other questions? You say there are 3 Rayburns of one of them was painted obviously at the time of the wedding, I think, of the Harriet Brule.
Yes. Well, if you put Harriet Gould into the wonderful Google, and out comes Wikipedia, and you go to images, there is that one, which I found on the internet. There is another one there too, and there's a third one of which we have got at home, a copy of a copy, rather faded and dirty, and somewhat cut down, just head and shoulders, which looks as if it's a Rayburn again. So I don't know how many times Scott was painted by Rayburn.
Twice, to my knowledge, yes. Scott wrote to her when he was in Malta, hopefully Naples, recuperating or trying to recuperate, and he says, "I wish you were here. I had your skill with the pencil." This is to Mrs. Scott Harden.
Yes.
So you know,
Yes.
it went on all the way through their lives. Those two.
Yes. My affinity with Scott, there's so many things, not just the sort of family connection, which is slightly tenuous, but my affinity has become ever stronger since I learnt about his love of trees and forestry and all that he did at Abbotsford to plant, and well-designed plantings, which is so fascinating. His understanding of landscape and his wish to create things that resembled the South Downs on the hills overlooking Abbotsford. And I've been very keen on trees all my life and forestry for the last 30 years or so. And as Peter said, presently the president of the Royal Scottish Forest Society. And I always think that Scott would have been a very enthusiastic founder member if only he'd lived another 22 years. Anyway, you've got Chris Badenoch, who is a recent past president, coming to speak to you at your dinner. So, and he is very knowledgeable on Scott and forestry. So you might get quite an earful from him.
Yes, we really look forward to that. Any questions? Before we draw to a close? Well, I'm looking behind me. We have. This is a small token of our appreciation. It's a volume containing presidential addresses in the past to the Society, one of which is by Magnus Magnusson.
That's splendid.
So you'll be able to read Magnus Magnusson.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter.
Okay.
I shall read that with great pleasure.
And all it remains for me now is, just to remind you, I ought to just say our next talk is on the 17th of May. It's Eileen Dunlop. She's written a recent biography of Scott, and her talk is entitled Scott in the Primary School, Past, Present and Future, and that will be preceded by the AGM of the Society. And then, of course, we have the dinner, the rescheduled dinner, on Thursday the 3rd of May. And all that remains for me now is to call on the very Reverend Professor Sir Ian Torrance to give the vote of thanks.
Am I supposed to sit?
I think so.
Is that all right?
I'm lazy. Let's all stand up.
Please sit down. Please sit
No,
down. You do know that actually you can put an image into Google. You don't have to put in a word. You can actually search on an image.
Explain that, please.
Oh, you can copy an image and then put that into Google, and it will find other images. So you can search on the image as well as the word,
Thank you.
which I learnt recently. Can I just say thank you so very much indeed. You've brought encyclopedic knowledge. I'm truly encyclopedic knowledge. I'm not enough of a Scots scholar to have read all that much of his letters, but you have. And the way in which you conjured up his life from these, and we don't write letters like that nowadays. I mean, I could never ever find time for these kinds of descriptions and the phrases and the affection which he puts into them. So little things which you referred to in the letters which I particularly enjoyed. I enjoyed the peacock and the peahen, the various ponies, the small dog curled up, the seal found at Flodden, the sketch of Colonel Sir Walter, the dismounted sharpshooters, the shepherds. I enjoyed the helpless indolence of the small, fat relative, the yelling at the piano, and the singer who ought to have been assassinated, the otter hunt, the way the Eildons appeared in these portraits, which I had not known, and that's extremely interesting. Then at the end you quoted from Christian's cousin's letter, 1862, of how a person who had heard him speak said he spoke like hearing history with the unpalatable bits left out. Actually, I think this is what you have done for us tonight. I mean, you have dramatized these letters, these detailed, well-chosen extracts. And so thank you, it's been delightful.
Thank you so much.